Welcome to Catalyzing Change Week. This year's Catalyzing Change Week is about solutions from the front lines by social innovators.
In 2022, Catalyst 2030 concentrated its efforts on bringing proximate leaders and frontline solutions to the forefront. Collaborations led by members from the Global South produced groundbreaking reports on climate and transforming education, with an emphasis on offering local solutions. We continued our mission to create an enabling environment for social entrepreneurs to flourish by initiating a letter to donors, signed by more than 1,200 social entrepreneurs and innovators. The Catalyst 2030 awards ceremony was spectacular, and the awards themselves welcomed by the private sector, governments, bio multilaterals and donors.
Catalyst 2030 as a movement is disruptive.
One of the best things I think that's come out of Catalyst 2030 so far is incredible collaboration across the ecosystem that just didn't exist before Catalyst came into being.
The thing I love most about Catalyst is that it's an open movement for social entrepreneurs around the world.
I'd encourage anyone who's looking to be more connected with their local communities around social development goals to come along to Catalyzing Change Week.
Welcome to Catalyzing Change Week.
Hello and welcome. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm Erin Lindley. I'm one of the co-founders of ABRI, that's the Advanced Botanical and Biomass Research Institute. And we're a group of consultants from around the world who specialize in botanicals and biomass. Most specifically, our specialty is in industrial hemp. And myself, my partners Carl Martel and Jeremy Hale are going to talk to you today about how we can utilize this plant for solutions for the future. So take it away, Jeremy.
Thanks, Erin. We'll go to the next slide. Perfect. So when we're actually involved with projects, so Erin, Carl, and I have had the pleasure of traveling to some incredible places. We're in Ecuador this past year, and it was an unbelievable experience, but we can talk about that more later. When we're actually working with governments and communities and universities, there's a lot of issues that we're confronted with and a lot of questions that are being asked, especially with everything involved with the climate changes, political changes, everything. So one of the first metrics that we want to look at is the life cycle analysis of what's actually going on, trying to get a deeper understanding. And that's where we developed our discovery period. In that discovery period, we have the if you can measure it, you can manage it mentality. So we want to understand the short-term values and the long-term values and really understand where we can bridge those gaps in terms of short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So the short-term values are going to be more of a linear analysis, which I'll talk about here in a moment, and the long-terms will be more of a circular system. So when we're talking about the missions, financials, the infrastructures, the supply chains, we're looking at a very finite section. Versus the long-term values, you're looking at impacts in terms of ecosystems, which are a bit more dynamic. And so that's more of a later phase. Madeline, if we can go to the next. So looking at these, we have the seed to shelf, which is our linear, and then we have our circular, which is the whole plant utilization mentality, which Carl will talk about later on. Next slide, please. So with the linear analysis, it's what do you want to know? We need to set parameters, we need to set boundaries, and then that way we can appropriately quantify everything from energy uses to social impacts to financial costs, and really create a balance sheet of where are the areas that we can do today. And that comes from a lot of the mentality of climate solutions, where we're looking at what's manageable today, what's a small step, what's something where it's when you go to the market, you take a reusable bag instead of using the single-use plastics, which our friends in Europe are far ahead of us in the US. So thank you for that. But we're getting there. So we look at the things of what can we do today. Next slide, please. And then when we're talking about the circular analysis, we're talking about a value of what are we learning? It's more of an opportunity to open up proactive issues that we may face in the future or things that we're facing today and don't fully comprehend. It's the before you try and create a solution, it's really understanding the dynamics of the problem to begin with, because what you think may be the problem may not actually be what's causing the issues. So we want to actually go into a comprehensive analysis. We want to meet with farmers. We want to meet with people out in the real world settings and say, really, where are your problems? Because as we deal with the Minister of Agriculture, they see numbers and they see certain aspects, but they don't actually get involved on a level. So we go from a macro to a micro and get really into the details of what are the issues that we're facing. We look at the climates, we look at altitudes, agricultural systems that are there, really how we can develop it. And so those pieces come into play, but then we also have to evaluate what are the impacts of introducing those things. If we bring in a bunch of heavy duty machinery that have a high cost in a developing country, it doesn't make sense because they can't even afford the maintenance of the equipment that we're bringing in. So it's kind of a defeated system. But that being said, it's everything has a place. And so it's a matter of, well, if we want to do that, how do we build to that without impacting the community or the people that we need most? Next slide, please. So talking about the circular system, I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with the cradle to cradle or donut economy. Carl will talk more about the zero waste. And really what we look to is when we're dealing with these types of systems, again, going from the macro to the micro, well, breaking up into really finite closed sections and then understanding how they connect. And then from that, we understand the system to the capacity that we can, but it's always an improving system. So in a circular system, one of the biggest hurdles that we see is people become complacent or satisfied with where they are instead of continuing to develop and continuing to innovate. And especially in the economic times that we're in, it's understandably difficult. But if you want to achieve this goal, it requires a lot of investment, time, and work. And so that's where, as ABRI, we come and we help support that with keeping things more linear and making the support systems more efficient. Next slide, please. So as Aaron was saying, we focus largely on agriculture, but also ecosystems and systems. And in terms of scaling, we want to look at the big three. Is it good, fast, or cheap? Then you can pick two. In a perfect world, I would like it to be all three, but until we get there, we're stuck with two of the three. So when we're looking at these, it's about efficiency and it's about creating momentum today and then directing and steering it down the road in the future. So we look at things from economy versus environment of it has to be economically profitable in order for it to be sustainable. Just like it has to be something that you can do long-term if it's to be sustainable. So a fixed, like you see the people that have the diets that they go on the diet, lose weight, and then they gain it back. Well, it's not sustainable. So we look at the ecosystems and systems similar to that in how is nature operating in a way that it's been performing for thousands, if not millions of years at its capacity before we began to impact it. So how do we replenish that? And then how do we do it economically in a way that's profitable for the community and supports the systems that they're in? And what we find is there's the mountain under the rug where there's the inconvenient truths that are swept under the rug. And after many, many decades of contaminating for the sake of industrialization, we now have this mountain. In the US, that's how the EPA was formed in the early 1970s. There was enough contamination in the 50s and 60s that was deemed industrialization, and it was deemed as a benefit to society to have rivers catch on fire and to have people dying of, lesions from cuts that they got in the river from infections and toxins and things like that. And unfortunately, it took us until the 70s to really realize the impacts that we're having. And now we're dealing with recovering from that. Next slide, please. So I'll go through these pretty quick because I don't think we need to get too much into the negatives, but my specialty in particular is with bio and phytoremediation. So looking at contaminations of impacts and looking at quantifying certain areas and aspects to benefit the groups and organizations that we work with. So looking at the impact of the business on the economy and society, as well as the impact of the long-term ecosystem. The infinite impacts of how are we looking at the long-term goals, which we'll talk about with the 7 generations thinking, which Aaron will elaborate a little bit more on, of how is my decision affecting my community, my environment, the area around me for the next 7 generations. And I'd like it to go beyond that, but that's where we really need to be more observant of. We're in such a crisis mode that we're so focused on today that we're not really taking into account what we're doing in the future. And so next slide, please. We get into things like water contamination. There's a indigenous quote of frog does not drink of the pond in which he lives. It's become an issue where it's become significantly more publicized in Europe, and it's always been an issue here in the United States of the water contamination. Like I said, that's how the EPA was actually founded, by the rivers and waterways being so polluted that people couldn't drink out of them. You couldn't swim in it, and that's where we're coming into the PFAS and these forever compounds in the rainwater, and really understanding what's in the water and where it comes from, understanding what we can shift, how we can use filters. And so that's where, when we work with water treatment facilities, we want to understand really what are they testing for, because if they're not testing it, then they don't know it's there. And so it's the cleanliness of water is determined by the work that goes into cleaning it. And it's not to say that they're not doing the best job they can, but as we progress through time, we've developed more and more contaminants, which require more and more work. So next slide, please. So that's where we've developed this, what I call the Jenga scenario, where it's the agricultural contamination. We've basically taken blocks as we've industrialized, we've created the DDTs, the pesticides, there's all of these compounds. I'm not even going to ramble them off, but as we involve each one of those in a system, we take a block out of the Jenga and set it on top. And what it's created is this massive structure of creating high levels of food that have minimal nutritional value. But what that's also created is an extremely unstable ecological system where we're now having runoff because we're having excess of nitrogens, fertilizers, pesticides, these materials that we're putting in because the soil isn't healthy enough, and because it's hyperaccumulated these compounds, these chemicals, these issues over decades, it can no longer process them. So what it's created is an unstable structure that's on the brink of collapse. And that's where we're seeing it. I'm from the Midwest, and they projected that within the next 20 to 30 years, we won't have any agricultural lands in the largest producing area in the United States because of these systems. Next slide. In terms of waste contamination, we don't need to get too into this. I think everyone here understands the issues that we're facing with these. So this is where Carl will go back into more details again about our waste management side and how we do the whole plant utilization. Next slide. And then there's the other issue that we find in Africa and South America, and really in the developed world, it's not viewed in the way that it should, of the mining contaminations, where we're looking at atmospheric emissions from dust and particulates to water contaminations, where these mining industries are actually creating significant impacts on communities that are holding them back, from making them sick to where they can't go to school, to where they're eating the food that they're eating is eating the chemicals that is being ingested and is passed down through the chain through lipids and fatty layers. And it's becoming quite a prevalent issue that we're seeing in the developing countries. Next slide. And then, of course, we have the fossil fuels. So we have the sludge, the slicks, the tars, the liquids that everyone's pretty familiar with how detrimental those can be in terms of contacts. But when we're dealing with incinerations, we're dealing with the ash and slag and particulates, that we're finding a lot of dioxins are actually contaminating our farmland because the ash is coming down, it's landing on the grass or our food. And as we feed it to our livestock or as we eat it, it is introduced into our systems. And so that's a carryover contamination that needs to be more proactively addressed in my perspective. But it's one where, again, we work with groups to understand better how they can improve the systems to work towards a better structure, a better industry. Next slide. Last one for me. So remediation, what does it mean? We can use accumulation. Bioavailability is what's present versus what's available. And that's where my work really pairs in extremely well with Aaron's, and we've gotten along so well is by managing to get these compounds out of the ground or out of the water and out of the systems. We're able to actually make more bioavailability for nutritional value and nutritional supplements, and getting back to feeding our body what our body needs and giving us the things that we need to stay healthy, and avoiding hospitals because our diet's changed. Not in a way of fast food, but in a way of having a tomato that actually has nutrients and actually tastes like something. That's my dream, is to someday have all the foods that my grandparents used to have before we were beginning to massively contaminate our spaces. But that's something that we can talk about another time. I'll pass the baton to Aaron.
Hello. Just give me a second. For some reason, there we go. Hello, how is everybody doing today? I'm here to talk about a different part of waste and what impact we've had on our planet, and how we can look to some solutions. As I mentioned in their introduction, our interest in providing solutions, whether it be through fixing up contaminated soils, or providing or coming up with an innovative solution to something that is already contaminating the environment, such as energy storage and energy production, where we look to utilize the hemp plant. Next slide, please. So my background is in natural health as well as in botanical medicine, and I absolutely love to be able to find history within all of our plants and medicines. And one of our oldest plants, if not our oldest domesticated plant, is the cannabis plant. I like to think of it in this way, as like, in the rainforest, if you see that there's like a bug who has a certain mutualistic relationship with a flower, wouldn't it make sense that human beings had a plant as well? And when we look at the indigenous cultures, we look at something like the relationship with people here in Canada and the buffalo was used in its entirety. It was it was honored and it was worshipped. And I think that that's one thing that we need to take into account when we are utilizing what I believe was humanity's greatest tool. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, hemp has been is our oldest domesticated crop. We've had it we've had it in every single continent up until its prohibition 100 years ago. A lot of people think that prohibition was because of the THC or content, or its ability to get you high. In fact, at that time, it was not a popular thing to use as something to get you high. It was more used as a food, and it was used as a fiber. The indigenous Innu in Japan actually had seed cakes that they would make to eat to bring when they went into war. The Bamayao Centurions, which is an area of China which is known to have the oldest people in the world, have a strain of hemp that they have eaten in their daily diets. Peasants in North Korea still eat it. It's cultivated all over the world. This is an important human crop for many different reasons. Next slide, please. As you can see, it's carried on throughout in our archaeology, in our history. The seeds are symbolize fertility and abundance. In fact, we wouldn't have North America if it wasn't for hemp, as the sails were made from hemp, and Christopher Columbus ate hemp seeds on his journey. Next slide, please. So I'm here to talk to you about what I think is one of the most important things that we can discuss when we're dealing with fixing the problems in our environment. One thing is that when we have education and we have food is when we actually deal with our environmental problems. A lot of people are looking at ways to address all these issues, and I personally think that if we feed people and we make sure that they're healthy, and then people will take care of their surroundings. An essential nutrient movement is something that is considered essential because we cannot produce it in our own body. These include amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, and cannabinoids. These are things that are essential for not just for any human life, but also for optimal function. Next slide, please. So one of the things I want to point out about hemp seeds is that when we're talking about crops in the world that are famine crops, crops that can help deal with food shortages, we're usually dealing with things like crops like rice, cassava, corn. All of these are very low in protein and very high in carbohydrates and sugars, not to mention that they are GMO crops and the monoculture has harmed them. I can't tell you how heartbreaking it is to drive through the fields in Paraguay and see what used to be a rainforest completely covered over in order to grow soy for pigs in China. Hemp is something that can be utilized. It is higher protein and it is a very bioavailable source of protein. Next slide, please. In fact, it's Ediston-form protein. So Ediston-form protein is most similar to the protein that we make in our bodies. It is bioavailable compared to something like soy or pea protein or some of these other vegetable proteins that we're seeing on the market. It produces antibodies as well as it helps repair our DNA. Next slide, please. Just to prove how valuable that is, there is actually a patent to the U.S. Department or United States that you can create blood plasma from Edison from hemp, from the protein Edison protein from hemp. So just to give you an idea about waste, when we're talking about food and nutrition, protein deficiency is one of the leading causes of death in children in the world, and this is a very simple crop that grows like a weed, like its nickname has. Next slide, please. Also, essential fatty acids. If we want to talk about cleaning up the world and creating change, we also want to talk about the fact that we need to have smart, educated people. And one of the best things we can do is feed our brains. Hemp actually has the most perfect balance of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. Next slide, please. And also the other fiber. Fiber is very important for all types of function, including there's fiber in the plant that also will help you build a house. But this is one of the few foods on the planet that provides all of your essential nutrients. Next slide, please. Now on to cannabinoids. A lot of people have heard about CBD and cannabinoids, and I happen to think that CBD and cannabinoids are one of the things that have kind of destroyed the crop of industrial hemp. It happens to be an amazing medicine, but one of the reasons that people are responding to it as a medicine right now is because human beings are deficient. As a result of the propaganda that we had across the world banning the hemp plant, we have become deficient in what is an essential nutrient. Next slide, please. We've all heard about the endocannabinoid system. In a very quick rundown, it's basically the communication system of the body. It needs to be in perfect balance in order for the whole body to talk to each other. In fact, in modern medicine, did not believe that that organs in the human body spoke to each other until we found the endocannabinoid system. And the endocannabinoid system directly responds to cannabinoids in cannabis. Next slide, please. As you can see, these are some of the conditions caused by a cannabinoid deficiency: migraines, fibromyalgia, depression, anxiety. It sounds like these are things that a lot of humanity has at the moment. Next slide, please. This is the part that I think is the most important when we're talking about human nutrition and we're talking about, feeding our bodies right, is that when an egg is fertilized and it needs to implant itself on the wall of the uterus, there is actually a cannabinoid that is involved in that. You try to find me something that's any more essential than that as a nutrient. Next slide, please. So one of the things that has happened as a result of this plant being legalized with the 2018 Farm Bill and more interest coming around the world is people want to develop products and they want to start using this. There's lots of different medicinal products out there. There's lots of different things, but one of the things I encourage is for people to eat raw cannabis on a regular basis. Next slide, please. hemp and animal nutrition. So as I mentioned before, and I think this is one thing that people need to keep in mind is that, you know, if we are what we eat, so are our animals. And if we eat our animals, we are what our animals eat. Next slide, please. And so when we are, so when Prohibition happened, they actually say that it was close to I think it's 2 to 4 million birds died within the US just because of the amount of seeds and these are wild birds, that they ate that were on the fields. We've also shown that chickens on a hemp seed diet will have a higher nutrition quality egg. Next slide, please. And we've also seen that cows eat less, and they also they produce more milk as well as a result of eating hemp seed, which was for the majority of the time that we had hemp, we weren't eating it like good hippies with hemp hearts on our yogurt every day. We were feeding it to our animals. Next slide, please. And so in feeding it to our animals, one of the things that we need to understand is that we developed this endocannabinoid system over thousands of years because of our relationship with this plant. It wasn't just like one day we woke up and we started eating the plant and our body decided it was going to have a system that responded to it. It's something that happened over time. And one of the things that happened was we fed our animals hemp, and we fed our animals this higher nutrition, and we got those essential cannabinoids in the meat, and we therefore had a healthier body. As we go through right now and not only pay attention to the value of our soil and the importance of our air and our earth, I think that we need to take into account what hemp can do in order to help us clean our bodies, feed our bodies, feed our souls, so that we can be strong enough to take care of the earth that we have, so we can leave it in a better place for our children. And as Jeremy said, I'd like to leave everything with, in every deliberation, we must consider the impact on the 7th generation before and the 7th generation after, even if it requires having thin skin as thick as the bark of a pine. Thank you very much.
All right. So I guess I'll introduce myself. My name is Carl Martel, and I will be talking about, some what people call hemp, or industrial cannabis is how I prefer to call it these days, since it makes up part of the whole part of the plant, right? It's you have industrial cannabis, recreational cannabis, and medicinal cannabis. And just to kind of tie in a little bit on what, before I get into really the meat of what I'll be talking about, is one thing, recent studies that have actually come out. So as a researcher, I like to stay up to date on things, and this kind of ties in medicine and food, right? So I'm not going to talk very much in regards to the medicine itself, only to say this. So we've gone through basically 3 years of COVID, and it's actually come out recently that actually cannabinoids, or CBD in particular, right, is actually quite good against RNA viruses. And that this being COVID is one of those. Dengue is another one, Zika, and there's a whole lot. And it turns out that actually consuming CBD actually helps to, it protects you against these actual viruses. It helps to stop the replication of those viruses and everything else that goes along with it. So you actually better. Now, going back to what Aaron was saying, you know, I'm a strong believer in, I think it was Hippocrates or one of those guys that said, let thy food be thy medicine, right? So if you're eating raw cannabis on a daily diet, as a daily diet, then you're going to be getting the benefits of all those chemicals from that plant. So saying that, and I just mentioned kind of an ancient Greek philosopher. So the Greeks teach us too that, you know, everything can be everything, and everything can be turned into anything, and anything can be turned into something else. Right. I think it's a really important statement when we're talking about cannabis, because this is a really incredible plant when you think about what you can actually get from it. Right. You know, not just food, medicine, you'll also get clothing, your buildings, a whole range of things. So we need to look closely at the plants that we use. Next slide, please. And this kind of gives you a kind of an overview of what this plant has to offer, right? One plant that can provide all kinds of things, right? So this is just a mind map basically showing all the different kind of things, products that you can actually get from this one plant. Next slide. This is some of what I do here. So this is using basically the waste material that is actually generated from the growing of this crop. I'm a very big believer in a whole plant utilization, that's one, but also using this plant most economically way possible. And that being said, when you're growing either on a hectare or an acre, you'd like to get as much as you can, right, from that acre. So, I'm a big proponent of growing it for food first, and then using all that waste for doing all the other things. I don't really see much of a point in the United States, for example. You have this corn ethanol. Well, they've actually used up a lot of acres or hectares of land, arable land, that could be used for food, and yet they're just growing it for fuel, which to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Where if you can actually grow for food on one side, on that acre, and also then use the waste to generate fuel, that makes a lot more sense. So here we have just a bunch of products. I'll go by quickly. So the bottom left-hand corner, for example, you see a red bar and you're thinking, well, what's that? Well, that's actually expired food grade hemp oil. So the oil that it's expired, I turned it into a paint and put it on the side of the building. That building was done 10 years ago, and it still looks as red as that today. It'll never peel. I guess we'll go through some of these things. So the top left is just a geopolymer that I kind of created with the hemp. Then in the next to that is a light accent plate that is made, again, it's just from the waste materials, the fibers from the plant after the production of food. And then plastics beside that, and that's a pure, both these two images in the middle of the top are both pure hemp plastic. That means there's no other binder in that except for the hemp plant, right? So then you have some cottonized fiber on the far right corner, carbonized, there's a carbonized electrode in the bottom right corner. And then beside that, I have an oil absorbent. So when we're talking about remediation, we have oil spills, these sort of things. This is where the hemp fiber can actually come in very, very useful in helping to clean up after certain toxic spills or things like that. And then again, one more beside that is that carbon foam, and use that in building materials, something that I was actually working on. Next slide, please. There's again, these are all from the waste generated from the plant. Now we're thinking, well, okay, there's some great things that we can do there. Then there's also one of the things we have to think about moving forward is our electrical grid or electricity. There's a big push to have everything electric, electric cars, electric this, electric that. The only problem is our grid, our electrical grid that we actually run is only 1% efficient. Why is that? Because they generate electricity, you have to use it right away. If you don't use it, it's gone. And the reason for that is because we have no storage, right? There is no way on scale to store electrical energy. They talk about these batteries, but they don't really exist on scale. And I think that's what's coming, is what's developing. One of the things I looked at doing was, I discovered one year was in mixing some of these building materials, I found that it was actually electric conductive, and then discovered, oh, maybe I started thinking, oh, can I store energy in my concrete building or in the building walls and that sort of thing? And that's where I came up with this concept. It's called BIES, or Building Integrated Energy Storage. So the solar panels on your roof, for example, could store the bricks that are on the outside of your building, store that energy there, and then you use that in your building. So, and as you can see in this picture, this is a 4.5 volt brick and about 5 amps, and it's charging that tablet. So next slide, please. So carbon and plant carbons. So I'm just talking about energy. Plant carbons, so they're really, really great at, yes, also storing energy, but you can also generate energy from it. This is what's known as biocoal, right? So we can actually, right now we mine from the ground, we mine coal, burn that coal, release the energy, and generate electricity. The problem with coal is that it's a fossil fuel, right? You dig it up out of the ground, you need all kinds of energy to get it out of the ground, right? Releasing carbon dioxide and other contaminants into the air. And all that CO2 that's released is energy that's been actually stored in the earth for millions of years. The beauty of cannabis, for example, or other biomasses that you can actually take and then turn it into biocoal, is that it's carbon neutral, right? So that the idea with carbon sequestration and carbon is that, you know, it's going to basically pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, sequesters it in the plant while it's growing, right? You remove that plant from the earth, like there, and then you turn it into carbon that can then be used as a coal to generate that electricity. Next slide, please. Biocretes, and this just comes back down to like hempcretes and other things. Now, as Aaron was saying, you know, we focus a lot on cannabis, but there are many kind of other plant materials out there that we can actually use, you know, like rice husk, coconut coir, bagasse. All these things can actually also be used in a way that's similar to what's known as hempcrete. So you have these rice cretes, you can have coconut crete, sugarcane crete, many things like that. And these are some of the things that we work at developing and promoting, using biomass, the residual wastes, and then turn them into building materials. Next slide. And just to get a few examples of the buildings that are actually being built all around the world. You know, you have them, the Adnams Brewery in England, or you have this building in Belgium, or some municipal buildings now in France, houses in North America, apartment buildings. Next slide, please. And thank you very much. That's pretty much it for me. And I think I'll hand it back to Jeremy.
Appreciate it, Carl. So yeah, so at this point, I think we can open up the floor. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone has any particular or specific questions for Carl, Aaron, or myself, I think we've got a few minutes before we end up the session. If anyone has anything for us.
Kia ora, Jeremy, Carl, Aaron, wonderful call it all. I just had one question around what's been one of the sort of biggest, hardest things for you guys or your team to help the communities when you are providing this wonderful, these wonderful process builds and steps for communities?
I would start with that it is the hardest thing is the stigma around the plant and what we're doing. And also there's a big learning curve. One of the nice things about hemp is that it's very, very versatile, as Carl showed with that map. And so in areas like Paraguay, what we were doing is developing ways to build hempcrete with the natural clays, working within their own building systems and stuff like that. And so I would say that it's education and fitting it into existing systems. I think that a lot of people are expecting hemp and these like any biomass solutions to be something new and fantastic and everything. It's like, no, but we can actually incorporate that into all existing systems.
I think one of the biggest problems, Jason, is actually governments, right? They get in the way. So they have all kinds of regulations, bureaucracies, and any number of things that tend to really be the problem. They are the problem, right? Because they also have, they have very limited education in regards to any of this stuff. And it's like, we have to educate them first. And yet, yeah, like Aaron was saying, it's the stigma that's attached around this, right? So it's trying to get past all that stuff. And I guess there's so much lobbying, everything else from big other industries that kind of try to block this. But I say government are the biggest problem to anything moving forward.
That's how we lost it in the first place, was lobbying for, the synthetic fibers like nylon, and then for the timber industry. So government, yes.
Yeah, and I would say to add to that, it's there's a lot of crossover of not only are humans, we're creatures of comfort, but it's also a out of sight, out of mind mentality for a lot of these larger corporations and governments, where it's we look at these systems and these impacts, and I've spoken to multiple the different researchers and different product developers for these plastics and compounds, and none of them know how many even exist anymore. We have thousands that aren't even registered. And in my home state of Ohio, we've had 2 major plastic incidences just in the past several months, where we're looking at significant contamination of farmland from these products that we're developing, that we don't have proper sheets to determine how to dispose of them or how to handle them properly. And what's happening is we've basically overexpanded our reach, and it's become a problem of the sense of we're impacting the communities that haven't even really been involved, like the island nations with global warming, where people are losing their homes. It's not their fault. They're not the ones that are doing all this. So it's easy for us to dismiss the well, for the sake of a profit, we can do this and get away with it. And it's the governments in a large part allow that, but we need to be more proactive. And that's where looking at these systems in the bigger picture of what would this do? What are the repercussions of it? Like Jurassic Park is one of my favorite movies. If we want to play God, what are the negative connotations of that? Like if we're genetically modifying, there are negative sides. It's just the way the universe works. So I would like us to be more cognitive of that. And that's where I hope a lot of our work will go.
Jeremy, I really like that you said that. I heard somebody say something the other day that there should be a law put in place that if you invent something, you have to be able to uninvent it. And that and so something like, Carl's battery, that's fantastic. We invented it. You want to uninvent it, it will decompose in your garden. Things like that. And that just switching that mentality it's happening over time. But I think that not just governments, people need to take responsibility for the actions that they've created. You're 100% correct. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question, Jason. Anyone else? No? Okay. I'll put a link to our website in the chat.
And one thing that I wanted to add that I really liked about hemp, and when we got into it, at one point we were sitting in Australia and we were talking to a group of Aboriginals there about how to grow hemp and all that. And this one man came up and he said, when we do this, I'm going to make my fishing nets out of this. And so from something as small as that technology, which is super important to making a battery, we can actually do this all out of things that we grow. And that is the prime focus of what we do at ABRI.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeremy and Erin and Carl. It was really, really interesting. Also, just to listen in. So thank you very much for hosting this. I'm just going to quickly share 3 slides that we have just to remind everyone a couple of initiatives that Catalyst 2030 is hosting. I'm just going to share the screen. I know some of you have already seen it, but we have 3 main initiatives that we are promoting at the moment: the awards, Catalyst Market, and the business commitment. So you can have a look at the 3 of them on our website. Of course, if you're not a Catalyst 2030 members, please join these kind of conversations, because I think they're very important also to achieve those common missions that we have. And then, of course, feel free to share your biggest takeaway about this session on your social media and tag Catalyst 2030. Again, a big thank you to the ABRI team, and have an amazing rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Madalena.
Thank you.